you very much, and hello everyone. I guess my mission here in this talk is to try and show how, when confronted with something multi-layered and complex like environmental considerations, it is actually possible to model those. And I think it links well with the last talk, actually, showing how you can get a really nice holistic view of what's going on. So I suppose, yes, I'm an actuary. I've been outed by Sarah in the introduction. And we often look at things, I guess, by looking backwards. We tend to try and look at what happened through the similar sort of circumstances in the past and then fit some kind of statistical model to that. But I think inherently that's a problem. That just looks at what happened. It doesn't really address how, whereas most people in the real world are much more interested in how things happen. So there's a real disconnect in a way that a lot of modelling actually takes place. So I suppose with something like an environmental situation, you have to really get your head around a complex system. Things that happened in the past, lots of interacting factors, lots of different things which have led you to today. And getting a clear picture of what's happening now does rely on you actually understanding the journey that you've taken. It sort of gives you a clue about the momentum that you have going into the future. And obviously a lot of the modelling that you want to do is about bounding your understanding of that future. So if there's an infinite number of things that could happen in the future, that's not very helpful if you're trying to make decisions and think about how your business progresses or the societal decisions that you want to take. So an awful lot of what this modelling approach is about is trying to bound that future problem and try and make sense of the dynamics that might play forwards. So this is the recipe. I'm a consultant, so obviously icons are the key tool here. The first step is to understand what the problem is. And we actually use a lot of techniques rooted in the social sciences to get that part done. So talking to a range of experts, diverse views, different worldviews, lots of different opinions, lots of challenge, and actually try and construct that narrative in all its complexity to try and capture what people currently understand about what's been going on, and importantly, what they think might happen in the future. And then you boil that down to a minimally complex view of that problem. So we're trying to get to the real core. If it was a movie, we want the plot. The rest of it's exciting and interesting, but we're trying to get to that real core understanding of the key drivers which are playing out. And then we can challenge ourselves by looking at data. And I think up until quite recently, what we found is that people have just focused on structured data, which is a bit like the joke of looking for your car keys under the light, because that's where you can see, but you drop them somewhere else in the dark. And what we're beginning to see now is that you can use, in a commercially viable way, things like artificial intelligence to listen in to the conversations people are having about certain topics. And I guess in the work we've done, it's probably fair to say that a lot of environmental issues absolutely need to include perceptions. The way people respond in advance of physical threats is one of the key things that drives decisions and drives real outcomes, like asset values, for example. When you're modelling these things, to ignore them would be a real travesty, frankly. So what we're doing is processing that data, looking at it in all its non-linear glory, trying to work out whether we can sniff out inconsistencies, whether we can look at tipping points coming on the horizon, which might challenge our perception of how likely something is. Often what we find in statistical models is people massively underestimate how likely an extreme outcome is because they've ignored the context of the current situation. So given all of that, we had a theory, we've looked at some data and challenged ourselves, and now we can update our theory about the future, and that's a really key part. It's a theory about the future. It's not looking backwards at statistical information of what has happened. Now, our weapon of choice here is causal models. Bayesian nets are one of my personal favorites. And actually doing that enables us to combine all of the expert judgment with all of the data. So we're being very, very explicit about what we do and don't know. And the model therefore contains the uncertainties that we might have about that future. And it tells us the consequence of that uncertainty. So if there's something that we really, really do need to know better, the model will show us where that is and what the consequences might be. And ultimately, it's all around getting insights about how that future plays out. So this is just a little picture of what a Bayesian net looks like in real life. And the reason we choose this tool quite often in our work is because they go backwards and forwards. So we can ask questions about what if the situation in the future would look like this? What are the consequences and the outcomes of that? And again, linking to the prior talk, it captures financial, non-financial, the full range of different outcomes that we're interested in, and shows us the tensions between all of those different outcomes. But importantly, it enables us to ask the reverse question, say, if I'm looking at a particular outcome, where did it come from? What are the sets of circumstances underlying the drivers that drove us to that particular outcome? And I think for me, in the monitoring of progression towards certain outcomes, that's really helpful. A lot of people actually misunderstand how factors combine, and they focus on lists of indicators rather than looking at them all in context. And so being able to come backwards and forming those reverse stress kind of questions is really important. So pulling all of that together, modelling complex and adaptive situations absolutely is possible. We've certainly been doing it for 15 years quite successfully. So I think it's important that people feel confident that that can be done. And really the focus moves from just doing statistics to actually understanding and learning, becomes a dynamic process rather than just modelling for its own sake. And a crucial insight there is that it's about the interactions and the dynamics. When you're modelling complex things, the outcomes emerge. So trying to model them directly would be insanely complicated and not very fulfilling. But if you can actually model the rules themselves, then you can just explore what the outcomes might be from those. We also want to get a mixture of expert views and observations. So we form theories and then challenge them with data, but ultimately the expert's the person who's got to form the view about what's going to happen in the future. And that's what should go into the model, not just the data. And we want to be super explicit about the uncertainty so that the model tells us what the consequences are of what we don't know. Importantly, I think for environmental issues, we want to bring in those perceptions. How do people feel about something that could happen in the future, and how will that impact their actions now? The model has to absolutely take account of that. So, final comment, wicked problems like environmental considerations absolutely can be modelled. Thank you very much. Questions?
Brilliant, thank you very, very much, Neil. And again, there's lots of chatter going on in the background with regards to this. A lot of that chatter is around, can you maybe give us a bit more of an insight into how do you model feelings?
So I guess there's two parts to that. The first step is to understand why the feelings matter. So putting them into the context of, if somebody feels strongly about a particular aspect of an environmental issue, then what does that lead them to do? So you want to form the narrative that puts that in place. And then the second thing, I guess, links back to this use of AI, which is quite recent in terms of its sort of wide applicability, is you can actually listen to what people are saying and then process that in terms of what is the conversation, how strongly do they feel about it? Who are they talking to about it? Is it sort of maniacs in an asylum talking to each other, or is it a widespread conversation which is being logically dissected? So the AI processing part now actually enables us to structure a lot of our understanding of that problem, and then that forms inputs into the model.
So just with regards to the AI, when you're saying we can listen into what someone's saying, we're not talking about eavesdropping. Is it more trying to understand what they're truly saying? Is that right?
Yeah, for legal reasons, I'd say no. But a lot of stuff that we've done, actually, you can look at social media and then contrast that with science journals, government conversations, mainstream media, blogs, anything digital that you're legally allowed to listen to, and even things like the dark web. There's ways of consuming that which won't get your lawyers upset. And you can actually listen in to what people are saying in all of those different forums, and then really the conclusion is about contrasting and comparing them. So dispersal of conversation through each community, consistency between different communities, those are the things that really start giving you a way of forming your own view as the expert as to what that tells you.
So when you're beginning to put together a model, as it were, what are the basic building blocks that you need, Neil, for you and your team to begin together to put this together, to then be able to get some answers or some better understanding out the far end?
So I think that crucial first step is the narrative. So we need a group of people who believe they understand the problem, to try and talk about it and tell that story. And that's crucial. Without that, you're just looking at what you can find rather than what you need. So the first step is to construct the narrative, get diverse views, challenging views, see if the story makes sense. Is there inconsistency in that story? Are there gaps? And once you've got that first part done, everything else sort of flows. So if you've got data for some of that story but not other bits, then fine. The data informs the bits that it can. The expert judgment informs the other bits. So it's that first step which crucially makes this work.
Fantastic. Thanks, Neil. So given what we've been hearing, say, for example, this morning and over the course of the last few days, where you're getting lots of different perspectives from different people who believe that they perhaps understand a bit of the problem, or at least are trying to describe the magnitude of an aspect of the problem, is this the kind of information that helps you get going, or what more do you need?
So I think it's creating this almost sort of Bayesian learning loop. So you form a theory, look, update the theory, and then look again. And so actually, interestingly, we did do some modeling on pandemics about 8 years ago for someone, and the model that they have exactly shows what's currently happening. So people's response in advance of the actual infection and so on are much more important than the infection itself. So obviously it's a devastating medical emergency, but all of those sort of social factors massively swamp every kind of business decision that's being made.
So are you finding it difficult not to say, I told you so?
I may have just done that online, yeah.
Brilliant, thank you very much. There's another question actually that's just come in here from Ludovine, and she asks, does this analysis show up the inconsistency of statements versus actions or outcomes? And the kind of impetus behind this question is that would be incredibly precious to convince investors to invest in more engagement with companies on environment, social governance, rather than just trust superficial, perhaps, reporting.
Absolutely. And I think in a way, a lot of the work we've done on transition risk in this space emphasizes that. So people say we're going to be net zero or net negative even, and they say that in public, but then all their actions speak the opposite. And so actually bringing in those sort of tangible tensions between the statements and the actions in the modeling does show that if somebody says they're doing something, it should lead to an observable outcome. And if the model shows you what that is, it's very obvious then if it doesn't do it. So I think for me, that's why modeling the how rather than just the outcome is super important to hold a lot of organizations to account, and to be fair, to give credit to the ones who are doing the right thing.
And is this something, Neil, I mean, are there any case studies of where people have been using this and it's working, not necessarily within mining, but in other sectors that we can maybe look at and learn from?
I mean, certainly it's something that's become a real priority in the financial services sector, because the Bank of England has asked everyone to look at the really granular analysis of their balance sheet for 2021. And obviously it's been delayed a little bit due to obvious circumstances, but they're being asked to assess their balance sheet, all of their investments, all of their liabilities through the lens of climate change. And they're finding that really challenging. So the transition risk in particular is something they're struggling with. How do you assess how people will react X years in advance of a physical event in the future? And they don't know how to answer that question. So certainly that's where a lot of our recent focus has been, in helping them think through how property prices might suddenly change, or airline stocks, dare one say, it might suddenly change because all of a sudden flying's not fashionable. So that perception driven transition risk is where a lot of this work currently is being deployed.
So in terms of your normal clients, as it were, Neil, are they normally in that sort of financial insurance type space, or what do they usually do?
So I think for us as a firm, obviously we're sort of primarily in the actuarial space, so insurance, financial services, so banking, asset management, they're our sort of go-to place. But actually we've deployed this across the whole sector. I think dairy was my favourite one, and that was different. Who knew about cows? But certainly I think the application of the technique is very broad, but it depends which sectors get the nudge. And financial services currently have had the nudge. I think the extraction industries had it earlier. And it's just sort of following that nudge around the different industries to make sure that they're thinking it through properly.
Brilliant. Thanks, Neil. One final question that's just come in from Julia. And she asks, are there any problems with bias in terms of the original expert views and where that may lead to the modelling, i.e. in terms of gender or other differentiators?
Absolutely. So what we do to try and combat that is we use a technique called cognitive mapping, and it sort of strips away a massive amount of that bias. So we're able to compare and contrast different people's views. We can assess whether or not we've got diversity of view across sort of culture, gender, whatever perspective you can bring. And I think that first step is so important to actually reveal that bias and challenge people with it. If you actually follow through a lot of data-driven things like predictive analytics, they're massively biased, but because you didn't do the first step of talking to real people, of course, you don't know that. So an awful lot of medical studies sample people of one sort of cultural background or sort of ethnicity, and all of a sudden, oops, the treatment doesn't work for that other group. So yeah, absolutely, that first step crucially surfaces and largely mitigates that particular threat.